Hey, so in an attempt to experiment with some new workflow approaches and just new ideas, I released the Destiny podcast, earlier today at the time of recording, yesterday or a couple of days ago when this will probably go live. And my plan originally was to publish a highlight from that podcast that would kind of promote it, but also kind of focus on a specific topic that I had planned to cover outside of the podcast anyway. But not long after I had pretty much published and got everything ready for the podcast to go and, make it public, a bunch of interviews dropped from Bungie developers specifically focused on the story. And it's funny because all of these tie very closely to a lot of those predictions that I had made before that were also going to be sort of, discussed in this highlight. And I think a lot of these, sort of what Bungie say, actually kind of bolster some of my predictions and, give some interesting insight and sort of intentions behind what they had planned. But I actually think that they, it would be good to include alongside these predictions. And so what I've decided to do is that after this intro, you'll hear the original highlight from the podcast I published on Monday. And then following that, I'll come back again in the present and I will discuss those interviews and kind of go deeper from beyond what I said in that podcast sort of highlight. And yeah, so if you want to skip this next section, you can using the timestamps. But otherwise, enjoy the highlight, and then I'll be back after the highlight to discuss those interviews. Thanks. I want to talk about kind of my thoughts on my previous predictions on Season of the Deep. So basically, a few weeks ago, I think it was a couple of months ago, a month and a half ago or so, I basically put together a really long and extensive article on how or why I think, or how, I mean, either way, basically why I think or why I thought Season of the Deep was going to, quote, realign the narrative. And I put like a bunch of predictions in there, and I kind of think that I don't know if I got it all right in terms of like, because I was speaking more from like a development point of view and from my understanding of how Bungie's sort of structure and how things have sort of worked. And I go into all the specifics in that particular article, so you can, I'll link that leave a link in the description so you can check that out. But I've written down a few of my kind of predictions that I sort of made that I wanted to sort of talk about. It's possible I missed some because I sort of, in planning for this, I was like going through and I found these. But these, I think, are the sort of the main predictions that I made. So I think the first one being obviously the title, Season of the Deep will realign the narrative. Obviously, we can't quite say because we don't know where the story's going in final shape and what we're going to get next season. But based on the fact that they're like, oh yeah, Savathun's coming back, and oh, here's the Witness's Origins cutscene. To me, I mean, that's twice as much as I anticipated. I knew there was something about the Witness's Origins, as I said, based on that Datamine cutscene. I knew there was that, and that had me kind of thinking that, yeah, we're going to be back on track. But the Savathun reveal, that was something I didn't anticipate at all. And that was, as I said, it was a really cool reveal. And so while we can't say for certain, I think that it appears that might be the case. That yes, that Season of the Deep has realigned the narrative, and if that then continues into next season, then we're on a kind of a good path to the final shape in when it releases next year. Then I think that we'll be back in action and back on the story that we probably should have gotten with Lightfall, which obviously Lightfall kind of went off on its own sort of tangent. And part of my prediction with that was that Season of the Deep would have some kind of ending, or some way it would tie into Final Shape and next season. And again, much like I just said, I think that was correct. We can't say for sure because we don't quite know what's in Final Shape. We don't know what's coming next season, but having the Savathun reveal and the Witness's Origins cutscenes feels like the story is much more kind of tied into like, yes, this is where Destiny is obviously heading. This is where, with Witch Queen, Bungie clearly had this planned out, where with the Witness reveal and all that. It is interesting seeing the mention of the Veil inside of that Witness's Origins cutscene, but it's much like I said in this article. Maybe not everything will line up with my prediction, because the fact is that when they announced that extra expansion, they did so a year before Witch Queen, which meant it was 2 years before Lightfall, and then 3 years before Final Shape. So, whilst I believe that something happened in development that obviously had they had a development shift and they had to move things around again, as I go into in that article. It's not that I'm totally wrong. It's just that they've had to move things around. Like otherwise, otherwise they are going to have these elements and these parts of the story that are just hanging there, being like, not being spoken about. And so they're going to have to integrate them, and that's kind of part of the work they're having to do this year, is trying to integrate things like the Veil and explain it more, so that people understand what it is. And that's what Lightfall should have done, but of course it didn't. And again, but a lot of people were saying, oh, that cutscene we just got should have been in Lightfall, and I agree that information should have been in Lightfall, but then it's like, but if that information was in Lightfall, what would we have gotten this season? And that to me just shows that my whole prediction, a lot of it revolves around the fact that Bungie did so well with Witch Queen and it was so well structured and planned out. How did this kind of derail and go into what we got with Lightfall? And I even think Year 5, last year's seasons, kind of suffered as a result, specifically Season of the Haunted and Plunder, because they were setting up Lightfall, which of course, again, if that was never planned and that was never where the story was intended to go, it wasn't, it didn't really ever exist in that form. And that applies to Season of Defiance this year as well, because obviously if Lightfall wasn't going to exist, then Season of Defiance wouldn't have existed either. And obviously Lightfall has always existed by name, but the content and the narrative kind of content probably was moved to Final Shape. And I don't think that's not wrong to say, because that just makes total sense. It's like, if you're adding another chapter into the story, you either felt that your ending wasn't satisfying enough and you decided to extend it, or you felt that you needed more time for whatever reason, whether to tell the story or for development's sake, and so you added another chapter, quote unquote, after, but actually you were adding it before, but you were keeping the name of that existing expansion to tie in to be for that new content, while you had this new name for the old content. It's a bit of a confusing, very, very confusing, honestly, overall, but that's kind of my sort of guess. But yeah, so back to my sort of predictions. Obviously, in sort of tying in with that, my whole theory was that, right, if Lightfall, specifically the content of Lightfall, if narratively that was filler because they were trying to buy more time or whatever, or that was added in late, then you don't just add one expansion to kind of, when Bungie say, oh, we're going to do an extra expansion, they're not just adding an extra expansion, they're actually adding 4 seasons along with it as well, because they have to then put together an entire year's worth of content. And so if that was the case, if Lightfall was filler, then that would seemingly mean that there would be 4 filler seasons. And my prediction was that Season of the Deep wouldn't be a filler season. It would be season 21 and 22, that being this current season and next season, that would be the originally intended seasons, because that would then tie into the expansion reveal, and then the last season of the year would be the last filler sort of season. But then, in seeing this season, I'm kind of questioning, because it didn't have much going on for the first 4 weeks, I'm like, wait, so maybe this was a filler season, but then you have the ending, so I'm like, oh, maybe not. It ultimately depends where the story is going to go in the next 2 seasons, so this one's kind of one of those where it's like, you can't quite answer it right now. It's possible that this season isn't a filler season, because they've kind of got out the main story bits that they had intended. But then, because it ties into the Veil, and because it ties into some of the stuff that probably should have been in Lightfall, that again to me suggests, oh, maybe it's filler. So it's weird, honestly. It's kind of weird. I actually think, to some extent, that the Savathun reveal and the Witness kind of Origins cutscene, that could have been like a way that's like, Bungie needed some big kind of they need some kind of big reveal and big sort of ending to kind of get people back into the meat of things, kind of thing. So yeah, as I said, I think some of those, those are kind of difficult to sort of predict. But I do think that my core prediction, at least, that the narrative that this season would realign the narrative, might have been pretty much bang on. It obviously just depends where next season goes, and obviously we will see where things go from here. Hey, so as mentioned, what you've just heard was my original discussion included from the first episode of the Untitled Destiny Podcast that I posted on Monday. And what I'll be going into now is kind of a pickup to follow on from that, discussing some expanded thoughts on that topic, based on these interviews that have just come out with various members of Destiny's development team. There's actually quite a few of these interviews. I've sort of gone and checked through all of them from various websites, but the two I'll be focusing on primarily are the GamesRadar and Press Start articles, and I'll include links to both of those in the description. And so first we're going to talk about GamesRadar's article, which primarily focuses on the intention, or Bungie's intention, behind Lightfall. And the first kind of major piece of sort of, I guess, detail that I'm going to be talking about is Nico Stevens talks about how seasons 21 and 22 are different to usual seasons, and he sort of explains that they're sort of more directly connected than before. And so specifically, Nico says, quote, "It used to be where we would kind of nod to what was going to happen in the next season, and then you jump into it, and it would be a whole sort of new story with a chain link between the previous one and this one. Now I would say that we're at the point where the events of Season 21 lead directly into the events of Season 22. And further in," end quote, sorry, further in, senior narrative designer Robert Brooks sort of adds a bit of extra sort of information to talk about that. He says, quote, "These are some of the most serialized and interconnected seasons we've ever done. Just narratively, I think there's more swing toward the fences in that regard. The interconnection between annual releases and seasons is kind of a chain link, and this year's is different in that normally we ramp up to an expansion and then we start new stuff with the seasons that come after it. With this one, Defiance and Deep are kind of like the fallout from Lightfall. There's a lot of narrative threads that were left very intentionally unresolved to dig into and expand upon and feel the impact of. And then from 22 and 23 onwards, it's the ramp up and lead into the dive into the final shape. It's a very different shape than what we're used to, so some of the narrative arcs might be done in a different way, and that's very intentional," end quote. Just quickly, I'll be reading through kind of primarily the sort of main quote, and then afterwards I'm going to kind of like sort of talk about each individual sort of point sort of as I go. So yeah, I'll probably leave a little bit in the timestamp, so if you want to just sort of skip sort of me reading through a lot of the various bits. Though one thing I will say is that, just quickly, is that Robert Brooks also mentions that Season of the Deep was in production before Lightfall released, and this is kind of, I mean, I had an idea that would be the case anyway, and I find it interesting because a lot of the community sort of suggested that the cutscene we just got with the Witness's origins had been moved from Lightfall. And as Robert says in the article, quote, "Writing something as a reaction is just physically not possible," end quote. And so yeah, I just sort of, well, I guess he's referring there is that, you can't react to like feedback like that but it's just weird to me. There's just kind of that weird thing where you've got like one side of the community sort of saying, yeah, like, oh, it's just been moved from Lightfall, and then, when the actual case is that it's, probably just the way that they've structured this. And as we get into it further in, I think there's a lot of signs that point towards a lot of what I said prediction-wise being correct, which is kind of what I alluded to at the beginning. But anyway, so Robert continues saying, quote, "For the most part, the arcs were there and have been there, and the plan was basically in shape as we were making it. It was the idea that the seasons would be able to take the things that were there, the threads that were set up, and kind of follow them through to their natural course," end quote. And following on from that, Robert continues and mentions the Veil Containment law, saying that there's, quote, "a lot of stuff to come for seasons and expansions," end quote. But I'm going to get into all that Veil Containment stuff sort of a bit later, though. Robert also says here about Veil Containment that he believes that it's kind of something that they want to continue using in the future, and they kind of want to use that sort of style of narrative delivery sort of going forward. So sort of going back to Lightfall, Robert says, quite a long bit of reading here. Robert says, quote, "I think it goes with the intention that it was always from the start expected that there would be mysteries unresolved at the end of Lightfall, and that the seasonal stories would expand on them and deliver the answers, and that would be how the narrative progression would go. I think what you're seeing now, the answers that are coming out, and the questions that were raised here that are being answered, is the payoff to the setup that was Lightfall. Usually our expansions are kind of the capstone of a year of seasons, and like I kind of said before, this was the middle piece. This was a middle piece instead. It was the capstone of what we led up to in Season of the Seraph, and then it was also starting something different that tapered off into the new year," end quote. And then following on from that, Nico Stevens sort of explains further, saying, quote, We aren't done giving answers and reveals in the seasonal content leading up to the final shape either. There are definitely more things that are going to be touched upon that have come out of Lightfall, and there are more things that have come out of the Veil Containment activity. Those answers are coming, they're in there, and like Robert was saying, it's kind of that structure of the down ramp and then onto the on ramp into final shape. End quote. And so yeah, let's get into kind of my thoughts. Obviously, there's quite a lot of reading that I've just sort of gone into there. First of all, I don't really buy into the fact that the narrative Lightfall was always intended to be this way. At least not in the way it's been executed, because to me, if it was always intended to be a mystery, that would have been emphasized in the actual like story of Lightfall more. But it wasn't really like it's only been till this season. Like I think even Osiris and like the Veil Containment stuff, he kind of there's a lot of discovery going on right now, and it kind of feels like all the characters are kind of like, oh, we don't really know. We're learning from learning through us from Asa through Sloane in this season about the Witness's origins, and on the Lightfall Veil Containment side, it kind of feels like, yeah, we're uncovering these sort of audio logs and we're learning about what came before, but Osiris and Nimbus both kind of are not really telling us all the answers necessarily. They're kind of learning as we are. And whilst that's not specifically like, oh, this is what the veil is and things like that, it does kind of feel like there is more of a discovery going on right now. It feels like we're kind of, that mystery is more emphasized here than it was before, and so yeah, I sort of find that with the way Lightfall was written doesn't really line up with what they're saying. Not so much that it wasn't, because like the intention could have always been that they were going to have a cliffhanger, and then we're going to find out through the following year as we leave the final shape that was always the intention. I could believe that, and I could believe that they intentionally left things open, but as a critique, that almost like it's a criticism towards Lightfall then, that really Lightfall shouldn't have been written in that way, and it should have been emphasizing more of that mystery and that kind of like, giving us a reason to go and protect the veil without actually kind of telling us what the veil is. I think you can do that, but you have to kind of, you got to weave it into the story somehow, and that's kind of what I sort of go into a little bit with my article, though not that my idea would necessarily have worked either. I'm sure there's plot holes that you can kind of point through my ideas, so my sort of interpretation of what I think could have happened. But yeah, I think that is ultimately the issue, though. It's the fact that those mysteries weren't properly kind of explained or kind of emphasized in Lightfall. And yeah, so sort of continuing on from that, Robert sort of he mentioned about Lightfall. Usually expansions are like a capstone of sorts, the seasons lead up to it, and then that kind of completes that arc. The expansion is kind of like the culmination of everything in the previous year, sort of thing. And they refer to Lightfall being more of a quote middle piece, quote unquote middle piece. And I don't know, to me that's sort of like, that makes a lot of sense, because if you've delayed or you've moved, you've quote unquote added another, they're like, oh, we've added another expansion, and to us that sounds great, but from their perspective it's probably kind of like, well, they've just moved the ending back a year, so now they've got to fill that gap. Well, it's like, well, they can't really have another capstone in that gap, because maybe they don't have something worth of a capstone, so they've had to be like, right, well, we need to, we're going to have a couple of seasons to set up the expansion, then we're going to have the expansion, which then ends up being this middle piece, and then you have 2 seasons to kind of conclude it, and then lead into the next 2 seasons, which would then lead into the capstone that would be Final Shape, which technically you could argue means that Final Shape has less setup than other years, but obviously that's technically not true, because Lightfall is almost a setup for Final Shape, as well as the season like this season as well. So I don't really think it. I think there's. I guess you could argue there's more setup, but at least in the sense that they're talking, the sort of direct setup, it seems like a lot more was connected to, oh, this is going to set up Lightfall, and then this is going to be the fallout from Lightfall. And yeah, so as I said, it's same in what I said in my article, that my predictions article, that the point of the narrative that they picked was to, at least seemingly, was what was originally the opening for the final expansion of this saga. Hence that sort of weird connection between the intro and outro cutscenes of Lightfall. And I could be totally wrong on this. It was a lot of the community, a few people in the community were kind of speculating on it when Lightfall released. But it is curious to me how they sort of just connect so well. Again, who knows? That could just be coincidence. It just seems really strange that that's how it is. Um, and yeah, obviously they say that, with Defiance and Deep, last season and the current season being the fallout from Lightfall, and the next two seasons being a lead with Final Shape. I don't necessarily like this approach, but as I've sort of said, in this context, I just don't think it's the most elegant execution. And I think they must know. I'm sure. I'm the fact that they write such great stories usually, and then this is kind of gone the way it has. I feel like even they must be kind of like, yeah, we know that that's not great, and they're doing quite a decent job, I would say, of kind of rectifying it and kind of explaining certain things, and while making it interesting as well. Obviously, it's frustrating, especially because some people say, oh, the way people spin it is like, oh, you made us pay like $40, $50 for this, and then you make us pay another $12 for this, and it's like, yeah, it doesn't come across very well, but I don't see it as a money grabbing thing. I just think that's just the nature of the game, and that kind of has always been kind of that way. So again, I think people are just sort of making bad faith arguments. And yeah, so I think that this kind of situation, it kind of, again, based on the interview, sort of further could sort of bolster my theory about how Haunted, Plunder, Defiance, and then another season from the current year are these filler seasons. In my initial article, I thought season 23 would be the filler season just before Final Shape, but now I think back that would be a strange idea, especially because you want the ramp up to be as hype as possible. But I actually, especially with this interview and what we've played this season, I actually think that this season, the current season, is the last kind of quote unquote filler season. And it's almost like I'm calling it filler, but I almost think that all in all, it's maybe a bit unfair to call it that now because they're doing a fairly decent job at kind of like righting the ship, And so filler is the word I'm using because it was to fill the gap, I don't want to, but I don't want to sort of act like the quality is lower than it is because I think actually there's been some cool stuff. Even though I think a lot of the season's been kind of slow, I still think it's been decent quality, particularly the last couple of weeks, and the Veil Containment stuff especially. And it's cool that they didn't just ditch that story and we're like, oh, we'll get to it later. They've actually been building it up quite nicely, actually. And I imagine it's given them more work to do, actually, with all the continuous sort of, need to sort of explain all this and sort of go. But then if they have kind of planned out for this and they sort of knew the situation, then maybe it's not too bad. And of course, I'm not mentioning Seraph in my sort of calling it filler, because again, Seraph set up Lightfall so well, and if we assume the intro and outro of Lightfall was the original intro for Final Shape, I would imagine that Seraph would have always existed in some form, and particularly that cutscene at the end of Seraph would have existed in some form, conceptually, as the sort of way to kind of lead into the saga sort of conclusive expansion. And again, I just think it is again, considering my predictions, it is strange, that during the year that was supposed to be the last of this saga, they just decided to take a different approach. It was like, oh yeah, we'll make Lightfall a middle piece, and I'm like, yeah, I think it is. It's ultimately because the situation changed, whatever reason it was, they needed more time for whatever, and they kind of just had to come up with a plan on the fly. And what they ended up with is that Lightfall is almost, like I said, it's bridging the gap between Witch Queen and Final Shape, and it's not maybe the most elegant, it's not maybe the most great, but I think they're doing a decent job of like righting the ship a little bit now, and hopefully the next season will kind of, show the fruits of that, and we'll be on a good path for certain at that point. And of course, I sort of spoke about it earlier, but they mentioned that Season of the Deep was in production before Lightfall launched. And the only reason why I sort of bring this up is because there was insinuation from the community, from certain people in the community as well. Also, I think some of them do make YouTube videos as well. That the cutscene that we got, the Witness's origin cutscene, was like moved from Lightfall to Season of the Deep. And I'm just like, that's just not, it just wouldn't make any sense. There's so many ways that you can kind of go, but that doesn't, that makes, a lot of people say, oh, this information should have been in Lightfall, and I agree on the basis of, yes, that information should have been in Lightfall, but I'm like, but then what would this season have been about? It doesn't really, the argument, I understand the argument, but it's when people start being like, if they mean the information, yes, I agree, but if they mean specifically the cutscene, like as if it's been taken from Lightfall and moved, I'm like, that does not make any sense at all. There are so many ways that you can kind of like push back against that argument. And yeah, so it's just nice to hear from the developer, even though I sort of, knowing their sort of the way they make Destiny and the seasons and expansions, I had an idea that was the case, but it's nice to sort of just hear it, said from Bungie themselves. And so yeah, moving on, I sort of just want to quickly talk very briefly about this other interview from Press Start, and mainly this is to do with the Veil Containment. I sort of said earlier, I'd sort of get to it later. And so in this particular interview, there's some additional quotes, specifically saying that there's going to be more coming from the Veil Containment in the next couple of seasons. And Robert Brooks specifically says, quote, "The Veil Containment quest that's available now has content that runs for the entirety of Season of the Deep's calendar. There'll also be entries at the start of the next 2 seasons," end quote. And then Robert continues saying that lore will not only provide insights into topics relevant to the final shape, but also what's to come beyond that, which I think is super interesting. Quote, he says, quote, "I think those are going to be revelatory, not just for the Witness, the Traveler, and the Black Fleet, but also some of the stories that will be coming up after the final shape," end quote. And so that's really interesting, honestly. I'm really curious to sort of know, especially if it's sort of hinting at what's coming beyond it. That could be some interesting stuff. And it's nice also to have the confirmation that, yeah, okay, we're getting Veil Containment stuff every week of the season, which means we've got another month, and we got actually probably another 7 or 8 weeks left of that. 6 weeks? I think we're in week 6 now, and I believe there's 14 weeks of this season. So that's technically, yeah, like eight more weeks plus I guess at least another 2 weeks, one at the beginning of next season and one at the beginning of the season afterwards. So that's going to be really interesting. I'm curious to know if they're going to have a quest tying into it like they did this season, or if it's just going to be you just load in. I feel like they probably have a quest, because I believe there is one, maybe 2 other weapons that were in Lightfall promotional art that haven't actually gone into the game yet. I'm not too sure, but definitely the hand cannon. The hand cannon was the most prominent of those. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously Bungie seems to like what they're doing with the Veil Containment lore and how it sort of is delivering that sort of story. I will say, I think if they're going to continue using that, I sort of either hope it's more involved or flows better, because it's a little bit underwhelming when it's like, you listen to the lore, it's really well voice acted, really interesting, I do like it, but it almost feels hollow, because once you finish with it, you're like, oh, okay, I've got to wait until next week now for the next bit, and then you kind of, you either carry on playing the game, or you just go, that's what I've been doing. I've been sort of like jumping on for the story each week, and then going and playing other stuff between each week. Obviously with Iron Banner and Solstice soon, I'll be, come back to the game more, but yeah, I sort of hope they make it sort of almost flow better, or make it feel like it's a little bit more involved, but they don't know how they're supposed to do that, because obviously there's only so much you can have content-wise per week. And again, if it's meant to just be like an audio log, then maybe it is better just having it being like you load in, listen to it, you sort of get off kind of thing. It's a way to get you in the game, I guess. And yeah, as I said, I think the Veil Containment and seasonal content, they're filling these narrative holes that as I said, I don't think that they were intended to be as empty, sort of open as Lightfall was, but I can certainly believe that they had some intention to continue the story through the year, because that's basically what they would have had to do to, they couldn't drop everything and have all this information delivered through Lightfall, because they would need to have something going in the seasons. So I understand that. But yeah, so as a sort of final few notes here, I just wanted to give a bit more positive sort of critique, I guess, on the future and, where we're headed with the story. Because I will say, one, I really appreciate the fact that Bungie have done these interviews, and anytime Bungie come out and talk, whether it's in the weekly blogs, whether it's in the Wednesday blog posts that we're sort of getting now and again, the sort of deep dives, and like the server discussion they did last week, and yeah, and just interviews like this, I really do appreciate it, and I think it's really cool to see. And I won't lie, like, it's so funny, because with all the ups and downs Destiny has, it's still really fun to play. It's still really something I'm heavily invested in, and Bungie just managed to always get me excited, like regardless, like, I'm sure the final shape reveal is going to be really awesome. And again, these interviews, while these interviews aren't saying too much, it's kind of just nice to hear, because the fact is, right, that if my whole prediction is correct, more or less, like, it doesn't matter if I'm wrong on some things. I mean, it doesn't matter if I'm wrong on any of it, really, but if I'm kind of on the right lines, it makes me appreciate the situation more. And it's the same with the server issues kind of thing. Like, it's what I said the other day, when we saw that the servers had issues after we had that Thursday blog. Yeah, it was a bit like, oh well, but we've already been sort of, it's been addressed, and we know it's coming. I saw a lot of people like making memes and stuff on it on Twitter, but I was just like, oh, I understand it's only a joke, but I'm sort of like that. It's not like we haven't been told now, and hopefully things will get better. And that's kind of how I feel here with the story. You know, I'm quite confident that not only if my predictions are correct, which I'm hoping they are, not because I just want to be right, but because I want it to be that I'm correct, so that I understand. One, it's just nice to have validation, and two, if I'm right, then it poses higher potential for the future, kind of thing. And I think that's exciting, as frustrating as it might be that we've kind of had this kind of, you know, sort of downward sort of spiral almost. It's cool to kind of have that to look forward to. And not only just season wise, but also the Veil Containment missions. I am honestly really curious to see what. I mean, I'm curious. Obviously, I'm recording this before reset on the Tuesday. This might either go up. This will either go up on the Tuesday, or I'm going to wait until the Wednesday, which is my original plan, to have kind of a highlight on Wednesday. Obviously, this is more of its own mini podcast now. But yeah, I'm so curious. Those Veil Containment missions. Honestly, the Veil Containment sort of dialogue has been some of the best, I think, this year. I almost think it's been the most consistent and most informative and interesting, honestly. And I almost think it is nice, as frustrating as Lightfall might be. It's nice to have that layering of not only the overall story, but also deepening what we understand about Neomuna, Lightfall, its story. A lot of cool stuff there. And so yeah, so despite everything, I am very intrigued to know where things have gone. Where things will go. And, you know, especially with the Witness's Origins cutscene, the reveal of Savathun, and the Veil Containment stuff, it just shows that Bungie have not lost their writing quality. They have not moved their writers onto whatever's next. They have not got, you know, a lot of people said, like, oh, they moved their writers onto, you know, all their good writers onto Final Shape, blah, blah. And it's like, I don't think that's the case. I just think it's a different approach. It's something that maybe didn't quite go to plan, but they are still hammering at it in quite a good way, and I think it's frustrating to be this way, but I think that they've done quite a really good job of kind of building on it, and hopefully that's going to continue at an even, you know, more consistent rate, because that's also a way I sort of grade seasons, is not only in like, oh, what was the reveal at the end of the season, it's like how consistent and what's going on through the season. Is it just we do a thing and we're told something vague and then it doesn't really add up to much? You know, there are seasons like Season of the Splicer that had pretty much a new thing going on every week, and I think Season of the Seraph was. And again, if you take my prediction with all of what I've said, all of the non-filler seasons, or what I'm considering non-filler, again, I don't want to call them filler because that comes across as worse, but we're just calling them that for now. All of the Lightfall connected seasons, we'll say, don't have that same pacing, other than Season of the Seraph. And like I said, it's when you go back, even Season of the Risen that came with Witch Queen, that there was only 1 week where pretty much nothing happened. The other and it was a 4-week season with an expansion, 1 week with a kind of not much going on, and then 3 weeks where something actually happened. I think one had a Inkblot cutscene, and another one had an actual cutscene that then tied into the Iron Banner rework, and the other one was kind of like the first week that kind of tied into Witch Queen, and it just I don't know, like I remember it being like, for a 4-week season, that was a really solid 4 weeks, honestly. And then, as I said, I think Haunted and Plunder were just kind of slow burns, and then Seraph kind of picked up the quality, and then Defiance and Deep have dropped the quality, have kind of gone back down again. But the last 2 weeks have kind of actually had something going on, and I'm really hopeful that the next 2 seasons are going to be much like, you know, Splicer and Seraph in that sense. Even Season, I mean, I think Season of the Lost didn't have, I didn't love the story of Season of the Lost, I didn't think it was as interesting, but it was always interesting to speak to Savathun every week, and that was a cool element. The stakes of that season were really interesting, and the concept was very cool, especially to precede Witch Queen. But anyway, yes, hopefully the story is certainly going to be picking up. That's my prediction, that's my hope. My optimism, my cautious optimism, and hopefully this will be the same for other parts of the game too. Again, I will refer to my last podcast and Season of the Deep to sort of focus on those, what I think of the state of the game and things like that. But yes, for now, I'm gonna shush. This is gonna be the end of this. This is obviously it's basically over half the length of the last podcast, so it's basically gonna be a mini podcast, in a way. And my intent now is to not record unless there's something else crazy that happens Destiny-wise that I want to talk about. I will leave this now, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk about more Destiny, whether that's before or after Solstice. I will just figure out when we get to the time and what's going on. If I even continue the podcast, hey, who knows? You know, what could happen? But otherwise, yes, that's my plan, and I'm looking forward to it, honestly. I do kind of like this format, and I think it's interesting to sort of talk about, what's going on in the game. It's interesting to plan. It's interesting to have that kind of, again, that approach. Something I'm not used to doing, like writing a podcast. So yeah, it's cool. And otherwise, that'll be it for now. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. So have a good one, and ciao, ciao, ciao.